the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
This is the Saline City Planning Commission meeting for March 22nd, 2023. Can the recording secretary please call the roll?
Young.
Here.
Carroll.
Here.
Fosdick. Here. Morrow is here. Gearbaugh.
Here.
Cole, absent. Beardsley.
Here.
Heft. Troika.
Here.
Staff present tonight are City Planner Auerbach, Community Development Director Harrington, and Recording Secretary Katnick. Would somebody like to make a motion to approve the meeting as amended or distributed? All in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Could I have a motion to approve the meeting minutes of March 8th, 2023 as amended or submitted? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Public comment. Under the Open Meetings Act, any citizen may come forward at this time and make comments. The person is requested but not required to state their name and address for the record. Comments will be limited to 3 minutes per person. Do we have any comments from online? No? Okay. Public hearing. Item 23-15, zoning amendment creating ordinance number 856, an ordinance to amend the zoning ordinance for Appendix A, Article 2, 4.13, to define, permit, and regulate accessory dwelling units. We have a memo dated March 16th, 2023 from Community Development Director Harrington, and a memo dated March 17th, 2023 from Planner Auerbach.
Hey Ben, can you make it display on the screen?
We see it.
Okay, cool. I didn't know if that one was off or not. So as you mentioned, it's ordinance 856, action item 23. I think it's actually 15 and not 13. That might have been a typo on my end. Zoning ordinance amendment to our code. So location, as with all zoning ordinance amendments, it would be a citywide change. However, how the code provision is currently written, the meat of what we're talking about, the accessory dwelling units, would be specifically allowed for R2 zone properties at this time. But there are some proposed changes to how we regulate accessory structures that would affect everyone in every residential district. Similar to the chicken keeping ordinance that you all saw a couple weeks ago, the regulation does not usurp private deed agreements, HOAs, or any sort of lease agreements that might exist. So from background and genesis of how we got to this point with this ordinance, there was a variance requested last spring for an above garage accessory dwelling unit for an R2 property. The variance was granted, but the city's preference at that time was to pursue a formal policy and process for accessory dwelling units. The Code Review Committee met last summer and fall to develop the mechanics of the ordinance to consider various aspects of what an accessory dwelling ordinance should and should not include, how restrictive or non-restrictive it should be. And they had the opportunity to review the draft of the ordinance that is before you at their February 22nd meeting. The code review suggested a few minor modifications to the ordinance, which are reflected in the formal ordinance document before you all today. So just to go through each of the articles as I did in my report to talk about the meat of the changes here. So Article 2 simply defines what a dwelling unit accessory in ADU is. So it's a dwelling unit that provides complete independent living facilities for not more than one family. It is an accessory use of a single family dwelling. ADUs may be integral to the principal dwelling, attached to the principal dwelling, or located in a detached structure on the same lot. Importantly, we do define what a principal dwelling and a principal structure are, so it does effectively hyperlink back to our code in a way. And then in addition, it's a relatively straightforward definition to begin with. Moving on to our Article 4 updates, the change in this article removes the links of our use standards as it relates to accessory building structures. So previously, accessory structures and uses were allowed in the R1 district, and then they carried that through by saying in R1A, all allowed uses of R1, in R2 or R1B, all allowed uses in R1A, et cetera. So it kind of carries through. That works great in code for some items, but uses, it can get tricky. And in fact, we changed an ordinance the other week as it related to marijuana, simply because there's inadvertently carrying through potentially allowing marijuana dispensaries in our limited industrial or light industrial district. The proposed ordinance in Article 4 also states that ADUs specifically are allowed in the R2 district, so as to avoid any confusion about whether an ADU would qualify as an accessory structure or building as allowed in the other residential districts. We explicitly call it out as an allowed use in the R2 as opposed to not calling out in the other residential districts. The Article 5 updates are really, it's the general provisions section of the zoning ordinance. It's already one of the longest sections of the zoning code, and unsurprisingly has the vast majority of the updates that are related to this ordinance. So first and foremost, it makes ADUs exempt from the residential building size requirements of our code. So we regulate minimum floor area of a 1-story, of a 1.5-story, of a 2-story with and without a basement for all the structures, residential structures in our city. To avoid any confusion, contradiction, or overlap, we essentially just exempted ADUs to follow their own accessory structure standards. Additionally, it clarifies and streamlines our accessory structure standings, removing preferences for the structure being a garage. So currently in our zoning code, you're allowed to have a larger accessory structure if it's specifically going to be a garage, and that's true for detached accessory structures more so than ones that are attached. For a variety of reasons, I think that there's a fairness issue with that. So this new code would just regulate all accessory structures the same. If you wanted to have a large gazebo and a very small attached garage, more power to you. You know, I think that's kind of the future of what zoning codes are shaping up to be anyways, is to be less restrictive on what that actual use is, provided that it meets the standards of the code and the other intent. There's also an amendment to the yard use section that further clarifies where accessory structures may be located. It's no different than how you're interpreting or applying the code right now, but it just adds some further clarification. And then most importantly, the creation of section 5.20, which outlines the accessory dwelling unit specific rules. So first and foremost, it will set the limit to 1 per parcel. It requires any interested party to comply with our accessory structure standards. It sets identical floor area standards to accessory structures, refers to our off-street parking requirements, which I'll get to in the next slide, and then allows sewer and water questions to be provided by connection to the existing services for the for the principal building. Looks like there's a typo in there, but essentially it says that sewer and water connections can go through the main building, but either through the request of the city engineer or the request of the property owner, you have the ability to potentially have a separate connection. This was a hotly contested issue in Ann Arbor where they originally required separate connections, if I'm not mistaken. Separate sewer and water connections run about $10,000 at least, so it's an incredibly expensive process to do. If we want these to be viable in our community, we have to write a code as such to make them viable. Otherwise, we're kind of thinking it with our heads in the clouds, but none of this is ever going to actually come to fruition. And then lastly, Article 13 updates. The change in this article requires an additional parking spot for homes with an accessory dwelling unit. So currently it's 2 per dwelling unit plus, and then now it will be 1 per accessory dwelling unit. We have not received any direct public comment or feedback besides the meetings with the Code Review Committee. So some of the outstanding questions for the Planning Commission they consider tonight is, are there additional regulations surrounding accessory dwelling units that you think were missed? Do you think the dimensional and setback standards for accessory structures, which would apply then to accessory dwelling units, are appropriate? And then do you support our incremental rollout of first allowing these only in the R2 two-family residential district, and then later expanding based on our experiences, feedback, and results to more of our R1 districts? So that's just another kind of policy question of how we want to approach these things. So currently our recommendation would be to move to recommend approval of Ordinance 856 to the City Council, similar to the chicken ordinance, with any additional feedback or recommendations of changes for their consideration. We're happy to then host a work meeting with the City Council, as I know this is a very potentially contentious issue amongst them, and then we could also loop you all in on that too if there was interest in a joint meeting on this project specifically. So with that, Planner Auerbach and I can take any questions, and he can add whatever he needs to.
Mr. Harrington, talk to us a little bit more about the discussions that were had at the code review level, and was this formally voted upon before it was discharged to Planning Commission? And if so, was that a unanimous vote? Were there any outliers or any dissent? And if so, why?
It was a unanimous vote. It was recommended to proceed to the Planning Commission. I don't know if we had all members of the Code Review Committee there on that day, but of the members that were, it was unanimously voted on to be moved forward. And I think the discussion really surrounded some of the mechanics of this. So should we regulate this separately than accessory structures as we already do? There was the conversation that, modifying our accessory structure ordinance was inevitable regardless of whether we pursued ADU policy. And I think, if you can fill me, I'm trying to think. I think parking, we were very conscientious of that and wanted to keep it to one spot. And we didn't want to over park ADUs. Can you think of anything else?
At the last meeting, the committee was fairly satisfied with the draft. So it is, the review at their last meeting, it was nearly identical to what you have before you. There was some discussion about the utility connection requirements, how the regulations would work with the city's new definition of stories was discussed, but otherwise they were in support of the draft as it is. Over the two previous meetings, we did have a lot of very in-depth discussion, and so everything you see was talked about in depth and meticulously chosen, as well as what was not included in the draft. You can elaborate if you like, or if you have questions about any of those specifics.
That's very helpful. Thank you, gentlemen.
Yes.
As a member of the code review group, I don't recall us actually talking about extending this into R1 at any point. So that seems to be a newer issue.
That was brought up previous to your tenure on the Code Review. So that was part of the original drafting of the ordinance prior to it coming back, of making sure that at some point, if we were interested, we could expand it to more residential districts.
I can help a little with that, just because as this came through when I was on code review, the real question became, do we go sort of cautiously and carefully, or do we take a couple steps forward? And the decision was to be pretty cautious and careful. And so the discussion about what, whether it be R1 or not, certainly started there, but it ended in R2 only.
Because that's what I supported too. Is I think we need to be very careful moving it into R1 because of so many potential concerns with building lot sizes and types of structure and so forth. The other thing we talked about was the connection for the water and sewer, and it did make sense that because we do allow, and I've got a building that's like that too, multiple water meters and things like that, we still would be able to charge the appropriate connection fees to some degree. It just wouldn't include the huge expense of ripping up an entire yard all the way out to the street and having to connect to the sewer line and all of that. It may become an issue with the principal residency in terms of, what flows through that and what could potentially become problems for them depending on where it's connected and so forth. But other than that, there were no really other bigger concerns with the group.
And if I may too, as part of my responsibility is to do sort of a head count and gauge the pulse of city council. I think to Mr. Beardsley's point and that of Councilmember Gearbaugh, I don't think this will be a heavy lift to get council to approve it, but I think proceeding cautiously and not including different zoning districts would be imperative at this juncture.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Senator Auerbach, did you have anything else to add to Mr. Harrington's report?
Nope, I think that covered it.
I'll move to acknowledge receipt then of the March 16th and March 17th memos, Madam Chair.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Public hearing is open at 7:13.
Noting the absence of any individuals besides our SETN director, I would move to close the public hearing.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Comments, questions from the Planning Commission members? Yes, Mr. Gravett.
Considering that we didn't have anyone here for public comment, it would have potentially been helpful if we may have notified the individuals within the R2 zoning area,
Yeah.
the concerns we had with others.
Yeah, absolutely. I already talked to the city manager about next steps, so we're going to carry it through Planning Commission, but then we'll definitely have at least 2 readings at the city council level because of the novelty of the ordinance. In addition, I'd be happy to do direct notices if that's the wish of the Planning Commission, City Council to R2 properties.
I would do, if I may, Mr. Gearbaugh, I would do a written communique notifying the public of our work meeting to discuss the subject, and then indicating in that letter that there will be forthcoming there'll be a forthcoming first and second reading at the council meeting at a later date.
Absolutely.
There were questions that Mr. Harrington had requested feedback on. Number one, are there additional regulations surrounding the accessory dwelling units that you think were missed, as discussed in the ordinance? Yes.
I guess I had one question. Basically, if this passes, can anyone just remodel their garage and call it an accessory dwelling unit?
There's more requirements to it from a building code perspective to make something residentially habitable. So yes and no, to answer your question. And then also, if it's a non-conforming structure with our existing code, it would further become an issue, essentially.
If I can, we talked about that issue, and even a concern was, can you turn a garage with just a slab into an accessory building where our building codes require footings and a regular full structure? So there were some issues in terms of even that attempt that you may have to rebuild the whole structure in order for it to be compliant with our building codes.
Right, there's only so much we can do to make the process of having these in the community easy. Some of it is going to be incumbent upon the property owner to invest in an architect and an engineer to design whatever structure that they're potentially interested in creating or rehabbing in order to accommodate an accessory dwelling unit.
Thank you.
So I'm noticing a 3-foot setback for the rear and side yards for an ADU. That seems kind of small to me. I'm curious how we arrived at that number.
Yeah, so that's actually the existing setback requirement for detached accessory structures. So there was the sentiment that if we didn't want all of our accessory structures to not be non-conforming, that we shouldn't then change the code that's been established since effectively the 60s. So it was kind of a back and forth and a give and take on, is that close? Yes, but is that so unclose from comfort that it warrants making a lot of properties non-conforming? That opinion of the code review committee was no, but we're obvious, you're the policy-making body at the end of the day, so.
In that situation, and I apologize for all these, there are situations where we have auxiliary buildings that are too close to other buildings within 6 to 10 feet. And I can think of a couple areas already that could potentially be an issue. So it becomes that concern of, is that within a reasonable fire code because of where it's built? And should we then make that, can we make that a condition of auxiliary units that says that they have to be within a certain distance apart, or is that a?
Yes, so within the accessory structures, there's already a requirement that it be 10 feet away from another structure. So if your neighbor built 3 feet from the property line per the code, you would then have to build 7, if I'm not mistaken. And then additionally, part of the building requirement for something that is residentially habitable would include fire-rated walls.
But what if it already was pre-existing and so within that 10 feet? Can we prevent the AUD from being built?
You could incorporate more stringent standards about the setback, but like Mr. Harrington mentioned, there's also the building code requirement that in order to create a code-compliant habitable space, that would kick in the requirement to have fire-rated walls within, I believe it's within 10 feet of another structure.
I mean, my concern has always been, it's the homeowner that does that without pulling the permits, and it's been there a year or two, and then we go in there and we have to push back, and it's the horse, it's the cart before the horse. I don't know how we can stop that, but it's that kind of situation in this scenario where I'm worried is that potentially could happen, and it has happened in the past, so however we can do to make sure that it doesn't happen, especially when you're building new structures or whatever.
Right. I will add that our rental inspection ordinance would likely also capture some of those folks and make the punishment far more punitive for building a structure without permission, renting it without permission or knowledge of the city. And there would be kind of stacking offenses in that situation. So
then this does become subject to rental?
you
may not be charging rent?
well, in the event that you are charging rent, then yes, it would be subject to the rental inspection ordinance. If it was the case of a duplex where, your mother-in-law rented the other half of it, or rented or occupied the other half of it, I should say, then no. So if it was truly a granny flat, quote unquote, then no, it would not be subject to it. But if it was being commercially rented, which is what we would expect to happen with most of these ADUs, then I would imagine, or at least that's what I would expect to happen.
And reminding this group is that it has to be an owner occupied,
That is not a provision in the current ordinance.
but we could make it that.
Yes.
discussion? Mr. Harrington, did you get do you have enough information from the questions that you had asked? We had spoke about the R2 slow rollout first. We talked at length about setbacks, and then we have talked about the other information that may have been missed. Are you good?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, perfect. Is there a motion to recommend to City Council to adopt or not adopt the new ordinance?
I'll move to adopt the new ordinance.
I'll second.
Any additional discussion?
I would just add that I really like the way this ordinance was constructed. It started at a planning commission meeting because a resident wanted to communicate his experiences with trying to get a family member into an accessory unit. And from there, it went to code review, and now back to planning commission, obviously ultimately city council. But I think everybody did a really thorough job of asking the questions, some of which you all just asked throughout this process. So I'm really happy with the way it turned out.
Thank you. Yes?
My only concern, and I can express this on council, is that I believe it should be owner-occupied required. We have that issue, if you look at Ypsilanti, where a number of these have been done, and it becomes more of a less desirable type properties when they're rented, and they're trying to maximize the profit out of those properties. It's going to be that concern, and the intent of this was to allow individuals to have the ability, as Mr. Beardsley just mentioned, family or other needs for people there. When it's just going to be rented out as properties to make profit off it, I think that's a big concern. And so I don't know how to make that recommendation at this time, but I think that should be part of our code going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I would just say that the owner occupation it does limit the possibilities of the ordinance to solve some of the issues with the city's housing affordability. However, I understand the concern and the intent of that. So if that's what the council or the planning commission would like to proceed with, by all means. But I would just add some caution to the effectiveness of this ordinance to add new housing to the community if we add continued restrictions to it. So
I would just add, Mr. Yearbrow, we actually did in the first meeting or two of code review really discuss that item, and for the reason Mr. Harrington identified, if we really want this to be effective, to provide a more innovative housing option, which is part of our master plan, and to enhance existing use of infrastructure and at the risk of a little higher density, to not require the owner occupant was the path that we chose.
Any additional discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed?
Nay.
Motion carries. Unfinished business, item 22-14, zoning amendment creating ordinance number 854, an ordinance to amend the zoning ordinances for Appendix A, Article 2, Section 2.06 to define public, quasi-public facilities. We have a memo dated March 16th from Community Development Director Harrington.
absolutely. So we went back and put our heads together with our city attorney. We talked about potentially adding another sentence ahead of the word uses. He didn't necessarily think that was needed, but he did agree that it doesn't hurt to effectively come up with more quasi-public facilities. So the new code reads, uses of an educational, religious, or nonprofit nature, schools, churches, hospitals, government buildings, and facilities, including parks, playgrounds, trails, and other recreational areas. I think that does the trick of capturing more of what a quasi-public facility could be seen as, a hospital in this instant, nonprofit nature. So thinking of things like the Fifth Corner, perhaps the 109 right on Michigan Ave. Obviously, those would be, or the Fifth Corner would likely be counted as part of this variance, or part of this ordinance or definition. Excuse me. The 109 wouldn't because it's in a downtown district. I mean, it is and it isn't. They would all fall under the same definition of this. So for the intent of what we hope to use this definition for, it's primarily, once again, looking at how we can maybe provide a more nuanced and a more articulate code that regulates uses and sign standards for these public, quasi-public facilities, excluding the schools, which we don't have the right to regulate.
Is there a motion on the table to acknowledge the receipt of the memo dated March 16th from Community Development Director Harrington?
So moved, Madam Chair.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Comments, questions from Planning Commission members?
Very straightforward, seems very reasonable to me.
I agree.
I'm looking for a motion to recommend to City Council to adopt or not adopt the new ordinance number 854.
I'll move that we recommend to Saline City Council to adopt the new proposed ordinance number 854.
Second.
Is there any additional discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Discussion items.
I had two, Madam Chair. You did a very nice post today, I noticed on Facebook, and the genesis for these comments are an email that Mr. Harrington sent out earlier today. So we are seeking some additional feedback regarding our master plan updates. And there is a community survey for those who did not attend one of our public forums or for those who attended one of our public forums. And we hear a lot of banter, a lot of discussion about preservation of green space, having some control and influence over development, the downtown, our commercial districts, and this isn't a great opportunity for our citizens to provide some comments and opinions. So I would strongly encourage everyone on this body to disseminate that through their channels, whether that be social media or direct one-on-one contact with neighbors and friends. But we really want to get a good response to that survey. And staff, specifically Mr. Harrington and our associates at Carlisle Wortman, have worked hard to develop that. So the more feedback, the better. And can you remind us, Mr. Harrington, when is the deadline for citizens to submit comments via that survey tool?
We've not set a deadline yet. So I think we'll probably have it open for at least a month, I would guess. I already sent it to the school district. I sent it to Saline Area Social Services, the Main Street organization, as well as the chamber. So to your point, yes, we're trying to absolutely get as much feedback as we can.
So if we told people by the end of April?
I think that would be fair.
At least, yep.
All right, very good. And then my final comment, Madam Chair, and I announced this on Monday. It's my duty to announce with deep regret, of course, that former Mayor Rick Coos passed away unexpectedly this past weekend. And I know several members of this body knew him or worked with him. I spoke to his son today, and there will be a memorial service in the city, actually at the Legion, a celebration of his life on April the 8th. And I'll be sharing more information on social media and via other platforms later this week. So please keep him and his family in your thoughts and prayers. And again, if you're interested in attending his memorial service, it'll be on April 8th at the Legion. I believe it begins at noon with a luncheon to follow. That's all I have.
Great, thank you. Is there a motion on the table to excuse the absence of Treasurer Cole?
I'll move that. She had a death in the family and asked that I make that motion.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Is there a motion to adjourn the meeting at 7:27? Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed?
That's it.
Have a great night.
You as well.